It's this part. Orcs, where did they come from? The answer to this question that is most commonly known is that they were corrupted elves that were captured by the Dark Lord, Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, whom Sauron was a servant to. And with this answer, these elves turned into orcs after being tortured, corrupted, and then over time bred into who they would become as orcs. This is actually the explanation that's used within the films, and so I think it's the one that is most widely known. In addition, this is also the explanation which was used in the Silmarillion. However, you may not realize or know that Tolkien never came to a definitive conclusion as to the origin of orcs. In fact, his earliest writings suggest that orcs were actually created from the earth and from stone and from slime. And to my understanding, this explanation provided some of the inspiration behind whenever you see the Uruk-hai being created there within the films. That idea that they originated from the earth, from stone and from slime, whenever you see that Uruk-hai emerge from that film-type substance. And that's actually the earliest idea or account that we know that Tolkien had thought of when it comes to the origins of orcs. And this explanation does make a little bit of sense because this is actually how the dwarves were made, or at least in a similar fashion in that the Valar Aule created them from the earth. Initially, they were not independent beings. They were these crude beings that needed to be manipulated in order for them to have action or to be moved, or at least that's my understanding. But then later, the god of the Tolkien universe, that being Eru-Ilúvatar, granted unto those beings initially created by the Valar Aule independent will and freedom, the ability for them to be independent and to have their own actions and thought. So in that regards, when we think about the potential creation of orcs, that would make sense. However, it does not make sense that Eru-Ilúvatar would give these potentially evil creatures the ability to be independent and to have their own will. And that's why there's a little bit of contradiction in that idea or theory, or at least that's my understanding. And then in speaking to Aule and also Morgoth, who was once called Melkor, those are two beings that were known as Valar. And the Valar were powerful, spiritual, angelic beings that were created by Eru-Ilúvatar, the god of the Tolkien universe. And those Valar are part of a larger group known as the Ainur. And the Ainur consisted of the Valar being more powerful and the Maiar being less powerful. And the Maiar served the Valar. So Morgoth was a Valar, but let's take Sauron for instance. His origin was a Maiar that actually served the Valar at one time, Aule. But later he came to serve Melkor, also known as Morgoth. And taking a step back, when creations of Tolkien had what's considered a soul, the soul within his writings is known as Feia. And so that's another idea or concept that sometimes proves to be problematic in considering the origins of orcs, of whether or not they had that soul or Feia. In light of that, another explanation for the origins of orcs that Tolkien considered was they were simply just beasts that had the capability for basic and simple speech. However, this explanation sometimes doesn't quite make sense, at least from my perspective or understanding, because in some of the accounts of the orcs is that they appear sometimes to be able to act independently. And if they're just these beasts that are under the command of Morgoth, it would not appear that they would have the ability to have that independent will and freedom. However, there are some creatures within Middle-earth that are intelligent, that are without Feia or without that concept of a soul. An example of that would be the eagles that are within Middle-earth. They are intelligent, they have the ability to speak, but Tolkien indicated that they did not have that Feia or soul. And then another idea or concept to consider is that if they are corrupted elves, then they would have that soul. However, that soul would be potentially irredeemable, which would also be kind of a conflict when the overall themes within the concepts of the Tolkien universe. When elves die, their Feia or their spirit leaves the body and then is invited to come and wait and reside in a place called the Halls of Mondos, which is a place under the care of the Valar, Mondos, in Valinor. And Valinor is sometimes referred to as the Undying Lands, and it's the place where those Valar and Maiar lived within the world that Tolkien created, that world being Arda. However, if orcs are corrupted elves, then they would have that soul, and there's a little bit of a question as to if they die, does that soul then go to the Halls of Mondos? And is their soul redeemable? Is it capable of anything good anymore because of the creation that's associated with? So that proved to be a little problematic as well. There's also a few more ideas. Some of those being that orcs were created after Morgoth saw the elves, who are considered the children of Eru-Iluvatar, and he made them to mock the creation of the elves that were created by Eru-Iluvatar. But that also has a problem, because there's some writings to indicate that Eru-Iluvatar is the only being that can create life that has its own independent will and being. And also Melkor, also known as Morgoth, his creative power would have been diminished after his rebellion during the creation of the world that Middle-earth sits in, that world being Arda. And then there were also other writings to indicate that perhaps they were derived or came from men. And there's even some writings that indicate the potential that the orcs, or at least some of them, could have been these bodies occupied by fallen Maiar. The Maiar being the lesser of those angelic, powerful spiritual beings. And we do know that some of those Maiar became fallen entities, such as Sauron or the Balrogs, who are also Maiar. That's a very quick explanation. There's actually way more to that, but that's just to give you some ideas behind the concepts of the origins of the orcs. The idea or theory that I tend to align myself with the most is the one that I'm most familiar with, because as ultimately before I read the books, I watched the movies, and the idea that they derived from elves was the thing that was most common or known to me. So that's usually in my brain or in my headcanon, that's what I usually revert to or go to. However, it's just interesting to know that Tolkien himself appears to never have come to a definitive answer as to the origins of orcs. And in thinking about how I might be able to apply that in my life, or how you might be able to apply that to yours, orcs frequently pose a problem to the people of Middle-earth. And they're not really a respecter of any of the creatures when it comes to that. They don't pick a specific creature, individual person, and then wreak havoc in their lives. They tend to wreak havoc in everybody's lives. And so one way that I look at orcs, if I'm applying them into my own life and how I might be able to read something and see what can I learn from that, is they appear to represent problems. And I know from my own personal experience that if I'm going to tackle a problem that I'm encountering, especially one that I keep encountering, I need to at least try to identify, where did it come from? Where is its origins? And if I'm able to identify that, especially if it's something that maybe I'm doing, maybe it's something that I've developed, maybe it's something that I learned, maybe it's a bad trait or habit, or a thought process that I've developed that I don't really realize that I've implemented in my everyday life. If I can take a step back and then realize, wait a minute, okay, that's why I keep doing that. That's why I keep having that problem at that thing. If I'm able to identify that origin, it can sometimes assist me in stopping whatever it is that's causing the problem, especially if the problem is being caused by something that I'm doing or something that I may not even realize that I'm contributing to this problem. Or the problem can be external, but sometimes even external problems are a little bit difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is that's causing the issue. Sometimes we think about finances, sometimes we think about goals or aspirations, and there's just these different things that for whatever reason that keep coming up and causing an issue or problem. But again, if we can identify and then come up with a plan or idea based upon how we observe the origins of the problem, we might be better prepared to deal with and overcoming that problem. However, sometimes, just like in the issue of the orcs, we can't come to a definitive conclusion as to the origin of the problem. That's okay. You don't necessarily have to know the origin. It can definitely help, but you don't really have to know the origin. Sometimes it's just beneficial just to admit and realize and recognize there is a problem. I may not know or understand why the problem is occurring, but there is an issue there. And in that admittance that there is a problem, then we can take those initial steps to begin to overcome whatever issue it is that we're facing in our lives, so that way we can begin to improve and make our lives better. And lastly, just a third thought, regardless if we're able to identify the origins of our problems, or perhaps we can't identify the origin, but we're able to identify there is a problem and we need to figure out how to overcome this. Sometimes it can become difficult to find the motivation to do the hard work to overcome whatever problem that is, whether it be internal or external. When this happens in my life, for me, it's beneficial to think about what's really important in my life and to allow that to be a motivating factor to help me develop those principles of discipline that can be so difficult to develop. But because I'm looking at, okay, this is what I value, this is what's really important, and I'm going to continue to remember, this is why I'm trying to do this thing to overcome these problems, whether internal or external. Oftentimes for me, that reminder is my family or my friends who I can visualize if I overcome these problems, whether internal or external, I would be much more aptly able to help them. Also, not only that, I would be a better father, son, brother, friend, and I would be able to be more present and be able to help them out more fully, which that's an ultimate goal that I have. I fall short of that all the time, and I'm really imperfect. I realize that every day, but it's a goal that I have to do better. And if I'm beginning to lack motivation to try to overcome those problems, it helps me to remember, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I trying to figure out the origin of my problems? Or why am I trying to overcome different issues that I may be having, whether internal or external? Well, get a good reason, your why. Oftentimes that's what people talk about a lot, finding your why. And as you find that why and then hold on to it, it can assist you in overcoming whatever issues that you're having in your life, those problems, those orcs of your life. And so it's just this part. I do find it to be very interesting that we don't really have a definitive origin story for orcs. However, I do think there's brilliance to them, at least from my perspective, and I think there's things that we can learn from them. So it's this part.